Hello, welcome everybody. It is Saturday, June 26th, 12:06 p.m. This is our GEM group, and my name's Ambz. I am one of the co-founders of Gathering of Expanding Minds. And GEM exists to initiate community discussion, build awareness, appreciation, and understanding by activating voices to speak up and share their experience, as well as develop a stronger sense of unity among younger generations in our community. And today's topic is reproductive rights or reproductive justice. We'll get into that in a little bit. Like I said before, my name's Ambz, she, her, and Hollie, you wanna go next?
Hi, I'm Hollie. Hi.
I'm Matt.
I'm Claire, she, her.
And I am Trey. Just to give like a little background and a little short history lesson of how we've gotten to where we are in the United States. Starting in 1965 with Griswold versus Connecticut, that's the first time we see a court decide that has a right to privacy when they make intimate and personal decisions, such as decisions about childbearing. And then moving to 1971, we have the United States versus Vooch, where that's the first abortion case that reaches the Supreme Court. And they decided that the burden of proof is not on the doctor to prove that the woman needs it, but on the prosecutor to prove that she doesn't need it. Moving to 1972, we have Einstein versus Baird, where that strikes down laws limiting access to couples access to contraceptives. So it allowed things such as Plan B to be more accessible. 1973, we have Roe v. Wade, which is the landmark case in this topic where abortion was struck down. Then also in 1973, we have Doe versus Bolton, which Roe v. Wade took place in Texas. Doe versus Bolton took place in Georgia. And that was another area where we saw a law struck down for the infringement on women's freedoms being too much. That's what the Supreme Court decided. Moving forward, 1975, we have Bigelow versus Virginia, where the states could no longer ban ads for abortion clinics, and they couldn't put state funding into preventing that. Moving forward, 1979, we have Bellotti versus Baird, which made it so that all minors, anyone who's pregnant under 18, doesn't have to seek the approval of a guardian or someone, their parents or anything like that. They can go directly to the court and seek consent for an abortion, and it has to be confidential and private from the public. Then we have 1983, we have the city of Akron versus the Akron Center for Reproductive Health, which struck down several city ordinances that restricted abortion in the city. They weren't allowing funding. And then in 1997, we had Schenck versus the Pro-Choice Network of Western New York, which that one prevented protesting outside of abortion clinics. They weren't allowed. That made it so that they had to be 15 feet out away from the buildings, and that they couldn't form blockades out in front of the buildings preventing people to enter. So that's kind of just like a brief history of where we've gotten today. There's still a couple more cases there, but that's a pretty brief history.
Thank you, Trey, for that. I really liked learning about the individual cases that maybe don't get as much attention or are more widely known.
Okay, so our first question we wanted to ask everyone here today is, what is each person's personal stake in the conversation, and how has your individual life experiences shaped your thoughts and opinions on this topic?
This is pretty near and dear to my heart because I'm a woman. It should be for every woman, I think. But as a 42-year-old woman who does not want to procreate, it has been challenging, to say the least. I have always been told that I could only choose permanent options of birth control, such as tying my tubes, if either A, I already had kids, or B, I had cancer. Those are the only two options I get. And due to being diabetic, I've suffered a few miscarriages with my husband, And birthing children is just not something that I wanted to continue to try to do. It's really risky for my health. And instead, I have to take birth control or have an implant in my body that severely alters how my body works. It can make it harder to control my blood sugars. So it's not good for my diabetes. I don't like that medical professionals and government laws are in my reproductive business. I just don't. I feel like I deserve to be able to choose my path without interference.
I am a lesbian. I do not desire to reproduce, and I haven't felt like that at a very young age. So it's a topic that hadn't come into my life until a very close friend was getting ready to go have an abortion, and I had no idea about reproductive rights. At school in Putnam County, we really weren't taught about reproductive rights or sexuality or gender and what that means in the world. So it was all new to me, and all I could think about was what kind of support and what my friend had been going through and how I could be there. I just didn't understand. And that was in my teens that experience had happened. Moving forward into my 20s and college, I know, there's several stories and people that have used Plan B, and if the accessibility to those resources weren't available, that was going to be detrimental to that person's health or their whole life and situation with their relationship, and being able to have that accessible was very important. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my experiences. And now with this group, and prior to this, it's the intersectionality of reproductive rights and social justice, environmental justice is all intertwining with one another. And I feel very passionate about this topic.
I can say personally, as someone who doesn't have a uterus, it's really hard for my opinion to overshadow the opinions of those who do. I was assigned male at birth, so a lot of what I think on this topic is, well, what do people who identify as women want? What do vulva owners want? To me, as a AMAB person, it's really hard to talk about this topic because it's not something that affects me. It's not something that affects my partner because I don't date people with vaginas. So it's definitely a topic I am passionate to hear other people's voices on, but it's not one that I have a clear-cut opinion because in the day it doesn't affect me. And I want to make sure the people who want to make those choices have the power to make the choice. So I have very little stake in the game.
Piggyback off Matt's statement, I really don't have that much of a stake in the game. I really am looking forward to learning more about this. Just looking into these court cases was very helpful for me. I'm not the most well informed on this subject. So yeah, I'm more of taking the stance that Matt took of, I want the people who are affected to have what they need, and I'm just here to learn more, really. So.
So I've been thinking about this topic a lot this week, and my role and my voice in this topic. This is something that is very dear to me, and even though I am 30 now, I'm not sure whether reproducing biological children of my own is something that I want. It was I don't know how to it's a topic that I just mull around with a lot. when I was in high school, I dated this gentleman who was an adult. I was a child, he was an adult. And he was not a kind adult to me. When I was 17, a junior in high school, I became pregnant with that man. And it wasn't safe for me to stay with him. And I knew that having his child would mean that I would always have to be attached to that man somehow. I was not strong enough to leave the relationship prior to that, but I knew if I was ever going to be strong enough to leave, I would not be able to do it with his child. So I decided that I would have an abortion at 17. I decided that it was not going to be in of my home life to tell my parents. And it was really interesting when Trey told me about the court case that allowed minors to access abortions, because that's the case that gave me access to the abortion when I was 17. I was able to go to a courthouse in Columbus and receive permission from a judge to later go to the clinic in Columbus and access that abortion. I stayed with the gentleman for some time after that, but I did get the strength to leave about 6 months later. Because of that choice that I made that day, I was able to go to nursing school. I was able to be away from that man and that trauma. Things still didn't work out for me perfectly. I'm a formerly incarcerated person, and that has happened after. But I am grateful every day that I did not drag another human through my pain during those years before I learned how to heal and grow. I wasn't sure I was going to share that today because I have never shared it publicly. But with the Supreme Court being the way that it is, I think it's important that people realize that they interact with people who have accessed safe and healthy abortion services every day. It is the people you know who have accessed these services. It's very stigmatized, so people do not share. But I'm sharing so that people know that they know somebody who has received abortion care. So that's why it's important to me to preserve it. It's important to me to have these hard conversations because the decision was hard. The whole process was hard. And it was not and would never have been made easier by laws interfering with that process, by people in government interfering in that process. It would not have made that process any easier for me or others like me.
Thank you, Claire, for sharing something like that.
Good, thank you. These are the conversations that need to happen, and your story absolutely matters.
Our next question, and the one I'm curious to hear from the three of you who identify as females, what role do cis men play in reproductive rights?
I think we will progress to a point where their say in the conversation will come very much matter because they have access to their reproductive health, right? And there may be incidences or situations where they feel, even if you think about in terms of like environmental justice and food justice, that's decreasing sperm counts across the world, right? That is a testes and sperm related reproductive health issue. So by the broad scope, reproductive health, I do think has space for cisgender men to definitely be advocates for their own parts and their own health in that conversation. I think it's really important that they're just there to listen and raise the voices of people with uteruses when the conversation involves a uterus. So, and it would be the same thing if there was an issue related to sperm counts and environmental justice. It wouldn't be me to say that it wasn't a big deal and that sperm counts are fine being low. It's then my job to listen and raise the voice of people who are concerned about that.
I feel that cisgender men should have equal responsibility when it comes to the reproduction process, and childbirth and child rearing. I don't feel that women should have to bear the brunt of that responsibility and then have their bodies talked about as if it's not part of them. It's really a personal choice for a woman, and I don't feel that I'm going to use cisgender men in the medical field because I feel like I don't want to say cisgender men in the medical field though, because there are all kinds of men in the medical field, but men in the medical field and politicians, I would feel better trusting a man in the medical field to make a decision like that for my body versus a politician. And I think even then they should only play minimal roles in the decisions regarding women's reproductive rights, or reproductive health. They are medical professionals, so I would trust somebody more like that. But I just feel like there should be more attention paid to the role of the cisgender male as a parent, as somebody who should take responsibility for what they have created. There's a lot of times where they are not active in their roles, and it's not a big deal to the government or to anybody else. And I feel it's unfair to women a lot of times. If I should have to carry the baby, birth the baby, and be responsible in that way, so should you. But also, why do you get to say that I have to keep the baby or that I can't have an abortion? Or, I don't feel that there's any ground there for that. So that's just my feelings on it.
I don't know how this is going to come out, but as cisgender males, specifically cis white gender males, acknowledging themselves the power that they hold disproportionately over our BIPOC community, cisgender males, and how they play a role in reproductive rights and acknowledging and paying attention. I think I'm hearing both of you, Claire and Hollie, saying, their role should be more about listening and understanding what that means for themselves and the stakes that they have themselves into reproductive rights as cisgender males. Outside of this question, I feel like we all have a huge part to play in this, and intersectionality of the environmental justice aspects and reproductive rights and social justices, access to food, access to transportation, how all those things affect this one area of focus. I am not an expert on any of these areas, but I would say the importance of a cisgender male plays a huge part in how we move along these conversations, the policies, what's being brought to the Supreme Courts, and just knowing that they have a lot of power to be able to persuade a lot of people, whether it's in the medical field or in politics. That's what I got to say about that.
So our last question for this group is, what, if any, topics do you think get left out of the conversation or do not get considered enough when talking about reproductive rights?
This is my favorite question because I do feel, and I'm jumping right in because I've been anxiously awaiting. There is so much about this topic that we do not get to discuss because unfortunately we are spending all of our time just trying to fight to keep to fake abortions, right? So even in the news this week with Britney Spears and how she was forced to have that IUD against her will as a, their grounds on it was because of her mental instability, right? And in reproductive health in general, that is some of where the most horrific atrocities to marginalized communities have ever occurred, right? So like forced sterilizations of whole minority groups. There was, and I'll have to find the article, but there was a med company that made this medication that couldn't get approval in the United States and other countries because of its reproductive side effects that hurt reproductive, but they gave it to poor countries. They tested it in poor countries. Female slaves and reproductive studies, right? So like a lot of what we know about the OBGYN field is because medical professionals tortured and tested on female slaves, right? That's where the whole, like, they don't feel pain the same. So that's why they tested. People in mental health hospitals, women in mental health hospitals. So all of the history, for one, is not talked about. And then even today, whether or not people with disabilities can have children, who gets to decide? There are couples with Down syndrome, for example, who people don't believe should have children, right? So like that reproductive issue, mental health illnesses, World War II? No, I don't know that one specifically. You're muted.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but when you're talking about the history of the OBGYN and with all the testing that was done with women, I didn't know if you're referring to like World War II and all the testing that was happening with the male Nazi doctors on.
Well, I wasn't referring to that, but it also, that's, I think the horrific part is that we have documented evidence of that happening in so many different incidences.
Okay.
And today, my doctor and I had a serious conversation about whether or not it would be healthy for me to have a child with my bipolar disorder. Right. And luckily I have a great doctor who really had that be a me-led conversation. But every day people are told that because of disabilities or different things that they can't have children or they shouldn't have children. Right. Not even that they can't. People lose their kids if they have certain disabilities because like, oh, you can't take care of them. So there's a lot of very real, very much now reproductive health related issues, birth control and the side effects and how we still allow that to exist as a whole. I wish we could spend absolutely forever if we dug up each and every instance of it going on now and going on in the history. And so I feel like because we have to fight so hard just to keep abortion access, we don't really get to have conversations about the past, the present, and what ethical issues will exist in the future, right? We have gene selecting going on and how you can pick the hair color of your child now with altering genes, right? And we're not having enough conversations about the ethics of those things because we have to spend so much time on it.
I feel like we are spending so much time on the one topic of abortion when there's so many other things that we have to discuss as part of reproductive health for women and men. Men men need to be involved in the reproductive rights conversation because they have reproductive rights. Unfortunately, their rights aren't infringed on as much as women's are. So for something that I think shouldn't get left out, and this is a really hot topic, I know, but is sexual education in public health. I feel like, teaching it in schools is like, I feel like that's the only place you're really going to get a statistical and accurate, maybe factual view of what happens in reproductive health. I mean, we don't know what people teach at home. We don't know what their belief systems are. And I'm not saying anybody's is wrong. I am saying that they may not be getting facts. And I think that's super important for young people and, even older people who maybe have been married their entire lives and now they find themselves in a situation where they're not married anymore, but they have access to a partnership and, maybe they didn't get that education about sexual health and, disease control and all of that stuff. So I feel like we really have to talk more about the public health aspect of it. How does reproductive health and how does sexual education, that intersectionality, affect public health? I feel like we need to talk more about that instead of putting it under a rug and saying, I don't want my kids taught about sex in school. Well, we all know what happens when you don't talk about sex at all. Young people end up having babies and then we come back to the abortion conversation. And I feel like factual knowledge and statistics increase public awareness, which affects public health. So I guess coming from the librarian standpoint, I'm a facts person. I need facts, I need hard data. So for me, that's what I see. And I feel like that helps a little bit more in these instances. So
they teach abstinence only still in schools. There are still schools that won't teach you the different levels of birth control. There are different cultures that don't use different types of birth control. So being more culturally aware of what are people's other alternatives and not just saying, well, if they would have used protection, they wouldn't have gotten pregnant in the first place. Or maybe if they weren't having sex, they wouldn't have gotten pregnant. And it's like, those aren't things that people are necessarily taught. Like, think back to when you're like 13 and 14 and you're going through those hormonal changes. You're not thinking about the consequences of having a kid. You don't even know what that's like. So like, to say that they need to be making responsible choices, no, we need to be making choices that we teach them what those consequences will look like and what the ways they can avoid said consequences are. Being multiple levels of birth control, teaching boys and girls the same things in school and not being like, well, it's just their issue. Because I can say very frankly, when my early sex ed stuff was happening, they separate the boys and the girls and you learn differently. And I can't tell you what the girls learned because I have no idea, because they're made to feel shamed and embarrassed about what they were talking about. So I think we need to start breaking down the taboos. We need to go in and revamp that education. That way people can have these conversations and feel good about what they're saying and what they're doing with their bodies.
I think along with that would combine critical race theory in these discussions and how the systems of oppression that are created by white supremacy are still what we're working in. And that has everything to do with how much of time someone gets off work to have an abortion and what that looks like and what kind of access to mental health care does someone have when they're going through a tough time. I don't know. It all, like I said before, is intersecting, and learning a little bit more about the terminology reproductive justice is something that was founded in 1994 by a group of 12 Black women out of Chicago. And the framework I believe they use the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise a child. And what does all of, what all affects or encompasses those three questions or those three phrases. Yeah, I don't know if it was Hollie or Claire talking about the sterilization of marginalized groups of Black and Brown and Indigenous folks, but I don't think people, I just learned about it today, about last year at the border with the ICE camps, with women who were getting sterilized and not actually knowing what was happening or what procedure was done on them because of the language barrier between that two different cultures.
I just want to jump in with I'm gonna link this. I'm gonna send this link to Hollie so she can post it on the Instagram. But in 1927, the U.S. court, by a vote of 8-1, upheld a state's right to forcibly sterilize people who the state deemed unfit to procreate. Often these laws were applied against people with disabilities, particularly women with developmental or intellectual disabilities. Women of color and low-income women were also disproportionately targeted. Between 1909 and 1979, more than 20,000 people living in California's facilities for the mentally ill and disabled were forcefully sterilized against their will.
I just want to make sure that when we have our live Zoom conversation, that everybody knows that this is a safe place. We can talk about all the issues. We can talk about all the things. I feel like we can't say that enough. I know people sometimes get scared to talk about these issues, especially thank you, Claire, for sharing your important story. Those are the kinds of stories that we need to share, I think, in order to get a better view of what is really going on. So those who join us, please don't feel scared. Come on in. We love you.
Having said that, we'll have our live discussion on Zoom on July 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The link will be in the description of the video when it gets posted here on YouTube, as well as on our Instagram through our link tree. So keep an eye out for a couple of those links. And until then, bye, guys.
Thank you to Jerome Gray and the Black Heritage Library and Multicultural Center here in Findlay, Ohio, for connecting us and being a wonderful community member and guide for this group.
Thank you.